I had rehearsed the moment in my head 100 times. Not the speech, not the celebration, just the sentence. Congratulations, we're promoting you to Senior Strategy Director. I didn't expect confetti. I didn't expect a standing ovation. I just expected clarity, recognition, a line in the sand between what had been and what I had built. I had led 3 major campaigns in 2 years, doubled client retention, reduced churn in our flagship division by more than 40%, created a KPI framework that was now being tested across other departments. Every metric said I was ready. Every manager said I was ready. Every late night, every presentation, every rewrite had all led to this. And then they called a meeting. Short, informal. Just an internal update, they said. I walked in, pen and notebook in hand, the room already full. Smiles, neutral nods. Then Victor from the board stood up. We're excited to announce a fresh step in our strategy leadership. Effective immediately, we're promoting Ella Martin to Interim Director of Strategic Innovation. I blinked. Ella? I looked across the room. There she was, sitting in the same seat she always took during team syncs. The intern. My intern. She'd been with us for 5 months. I had interviewed her. I had trained her. I had written half her onboarding documentation by hand because the formal HR material was still outdated. I had walked her through our systems, let her shadow my meetings, explained our client history, even introduced her to external partners. Carefully, professionally, knowing full well she was still learning. And now she was being promoted into the role I had spent 3 years preparing for. I waited for context, an explanation, a mention of mentorship, but none came. Just a few sentences about new energy, cross-generational synergy, and strategic alignment. No one made eye contact, not because they didn't know what had happened, because they did. After the meeting, Ella came up to me, hesitant smile. I'm really grateful. You taught me so much. I smiled, small, contained. Glad to help. I didn't say more. What was there to say? She wasn't malicious. She was just convenient. A symbol, a narrative, a name with no history, but the right connections. I learned later, in fragments, that her uncle had recently joined the board, that he'd pushed for a more modern leadership structure, that her appointment was part of a broader vision, not based on deliverables, but long-term alignment. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask for a meeting. I didn't try to explain my side, because the system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as it was built, to reward image over labor, access over merit, proximity over persistence. I walked back to my desk, opened my folder labeled Strategic Pipeline 2023, and quietly saved a copy under a new name. Continuity, original, because they had taken the title. But the framework? That was still mine, and I had no intention of letting them forget that. The announcement circulated later that afternoon. A clean graphic in the internal newsletter. Meet Ella Martin, our new Interim Director of Strategic Innovation. A headshot. A short blurb. No mention of tenure, no mention of contribution. Just a few lines about her fresh perspective and visionary alignment with the evolving direction of the company. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not out of shock. I'd already metabolized that. I was looking for something else. An acknowledgement, a footnote, a single word that suggested any part of her appointment was built on what I had laid down. But there was nothing. The next day, she led her first meeting. I was there, as expected, seated at the edge of the table where my role had quietly shifted from lead to observer. She clicked through slides I had written, reused metrics I had spent weeks structuring, referenced case studies I had compiled from scratch. She stumbled once, glossed over a client nuance she didn't fully grasp, then recovered with a phrase I had used in a strategy memo 3 months ago. No one corrected her, no one added context. Because everyone in that room had learned the same thing. It was safer to smile along than to say aloud what they already knew. When the meeting ended, she turned to me and asked, lightly, "Was that okay?" I nodded. "Fine." I didn't say, "You missed the detail about the client's internal budget restrictions." I didn't say, "The KPI shift you quoted isn't live yet, it's still in review." I just let it pass, because correction, in that moment, would have been read as defensiveness. And I wasn't defending anything. I was observing. And recording. That night I opened a blank document. I titled it, Structures borrowed, Q1 to present. I listed each file I had authored, each meeting I had led, each data set that had been repurposed, not with bitterness, with precision. Because this wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about protecting the truth for the day they would need to remember where the success had actually come from. Over the next week, my name quietly vanished from a few shared folders. I received fewer meeting invites, fewer status check-ins. One afternoon, I found that the performance dashboard I had built, the one used across 4 teams, had been copied into a new workspace labeled Ella Vision 2024. I didn't say a word. I downloaded the original file, saved it with metadata intact. I didn't plan to use it, but I wanted it documented, because one day someone would ask why the numbers no longer made sense, why the logic had begun to slip, and they would trace it back, not to a mistake, not to a failure, but to an absence. An absence they had chosen, quietly, politically, strategically. And when that day came, I didn't want to be remembered as bitter. I wanted to be remembered as right, not in opinion, in record. Because I wasn't planning revenge. I was building memory. And memory, when nurtured in silence, becomes the loudest voice in the room. When the room finally stops pretending it knows what it's doing. I stopped finishing her sentences. It was subtle at first, just a pause when she stumbled in a meeting, a delay before offering clarification when a client pushed back. I let the silence sit, awkward and unscripted, until someone else filled it. Or didn't. Ella had grown comfortable in the borrowed confidence of a system too eager to crown a new face. But she hadn't realized yet. Influence doesn't transfer by title. It builds over time, in the details, in the trust. And the trust wasn't with her. It was with me. But I wasn't going to defend that. I was going to let it show. The week after her promotion, a client emailed a question about our quarterly metrics adjustment. She replied first, offering a brief, rehearsed summary, copied almost word for word from the internal template I'd written 6 months earlier. Then she CC'd me. Let me know if I missed anything. I didn't correct her. I didn't hit reply all. I just responded to her privately. You left out the variable shift in Q2 projections. That number's no longer accurate. She didn't reply. The next day, the client followed up. With me, not her. That's how it started. A slow recentering. I didn't announce my relevance. I just stopped shielding them from their oversight. I stopped answering before being asked. Stopped editing the decks at night. Stopped adding the strategic notes behind the scenes so Ella could deliver them as if they were her own. I gave exactly what I was asked for. No more, no less. And it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Internally, timelines began to stretch. Briefings became vague. The tone in meetings shifted from clarity to performance. Everyone still smiled, but now their eyes darted more. They asked fewer questions, took more notes, checked with each other before speaking. Because when the center steps back, even the illusion of order begins to shake. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was allowing space for the truth to settle. That the work had always run on trust, not hierarchy, not charisma, just quiet, sustained competence. And when that is removed, things don't collapse immediately. They drift. I kept my pace slow. I tracked version histories, noted where my frameworks were being recycled, saved copies, dated them. Quietly, methodically. Not to attack, to clarify. Because one day, the system would need to explain what had changed, why results had softened, why clients were no longer reassured. And I wanted no one, absolutely no one, to say it was sudden. Because it wasn't. It had begun the moment they decided that proximity to power mattered more than presence in the process. I was still here, but I was no longer holding the weight for them. And they were just beginning to feel it. By the end of the month, the shape of things had shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. Deadlines began to slide. Not drastically, just enough to be noticed. Emails took longer to get answered. Meetings stretched without direction. Clients followed up more than they used to. And Ella, she started asking more questions. Not the kind she used to ask when she was learning, the kind you ask when you're no longer sure the room believes you should be leading it. I didn't gloat. I didn't hint. I just stayed steady. Answered what I was asked. Corrected what I had to. But I stopped anticipating. I stopped filling the void before it formed. Because that's what I had always done. Cleaned the edges before they frayed. Now I let them fray. One morning, I received an email from a longtime client. The subject line was simple: quick check in. The message was shorter. Are you still leading our quarterly reviews? The last one felt off. I stared at the screen for a full minute before responding. Number. But I'm still here if you need clarity. That was all I said. I didn't name names. I didn't explain the promotion. I let the weight of the phrase do the rest. Still here. If you need clarity. 2 days later, that same client forwarded feedback to Victor. Professional. Calm, firm. We'd like to revisit who's managing our strategic direction. We've noticed a drop in responsiveness and cohesion. He replied, formally, carefully, thanking them for their transparency. He didn't loop me in, but Diane from HR messaged me quietly. Just a heads up, client dissatisfaction's going upstairs. People are starting to ask questions. I didn't respond, because I already had. Not with words, with absence. The kind of absence that isn't loud or dramatic. Just the slow, steady removal of uncredited labor. The kind of absence that leaves behind not silence, but disruption. Because what they didn't realize when they handed over my role to a name with the right connection was that they weren't promoting a successor. They were displacing a foundation. And now the surface was beginning to shift. I reviewed my records again that night. Not out of doubt, but out of discipline. Every version of every strategy deck. Every early draft of every model. I created a timeline. Added dates, not for defense, for memory. Because the next phase wouldn't be triggered by me. It would be triggered by failure. And when that came, I didn't want to be the one yelling, "I told you so." I wanted to be the one holding the quiet proof. The kind no one questions when the room is ready to listen again. It didn't start with a crisis. It started with a hesitation. A pause in the middle of a client presentation where Ella glanced at the wrong slide, fumbled a metric, and recovered with a vague, polished phrase that meant nothing. The client didn't call it out, but they didn't nod either. And in that stillness, something shifted. The following week, 2 clients missed their usual check-ins. Not because they were unresponsive, but because they no longer saw value in attending. "We'll review the report on our own," they said. It wasn't a rejection. It was a quiet retraction of trust. Internally, meetings grew longer. Decisions were deferred more often. Ella began rescheduling briefings she used to run with confidence. Just aligning with other priorities, she'd say, but what she was really doing was stalling, trying to buy time from a system that was no longer protecting her. Meanwhile, Victor's enthusiasm cooled. He still spoke in town halls, still threw around visionary words, but now he checked his notes more, asked clarifying questions in meetings he used to lead. I knew that look. It was the expression of someone slowly realizing that what they thought was structure was actually personality. And they had bet on the wrong one. The data didn't help. Q2 projections dipped below target. A major partner raised a concern about delayed implementation. The client satisfaction index, which I had once stabilized through consistent systems, dropped 6 points. I wasn't involved in any of these reviews, not officially, but I saw the reports. Diane forwarded them quietly. "Thought you'd want to see this," she wrote. "Looks familiar." I didn't reply. I just saved the files, because I understood. The unraveling wasn't going to come from a single blow. It would come from accumulation. The missed steps, the skipped context, the erosion of trust that happens when a room is led by someone fluent in performance but not in purpose. Ella started appearing less. First, it was a sick day, then working remotely, then nothing at all. Her calendar sat blank. Her Slack status defaulted to away. Rumors moved faster than emails. She's overwhelmed. She's being reassigned. She's in over her head. No one said the word mistake, but the silence spoke loud enough. And I stayed still, present, cordial, helpful when asked, but I didn't step forward. Because this wasn't the time to reclaim anything. It was the time to let the pattern expose itself. And it was. Clearly, quietly, inevitably. 2 weeks later, a senior client from a long-standing account sent an email directly to Victor. It was brief, professional, clear. "We'd like to request a strategic review. We've seen inconsistency in communication and would prefer to revisit who's leading our campaigns moving forward." No accusations, no drama. just a shift in expectation, from tolerating to questioning, from assumption to scrutiny. Victor didn't forward the message, but Diane did, with one line. They're coming around. I didn't celebrate. I just reopened my documentation, double-checked the timeline, updated a few files, because I understood what came next. Not confrontation, but reckoning. I started receiving quiet messages from former peers. People who had once nodded along in meetings, now asking to grab a coffee, to pick my brain, to check in. They never mentioned Ella. They didn't need to. They were reaching out to reconnect with what had gone missing. Structure, memory, reliability. And underneath that was something deeper. Regret. I didn't hold it against them. The system we worked in didn't reward speaking up. It rewarded proximity, and they had bet on convenience, not clarity. I just hadn't made it easy for them to ignore the difference. By then, the client feedback had reached the board. A review was scheduled. I wasn't invited, but I knew it was happening because Victor canceled 3 department syncs in a row, and Ella's name quietly disappeared from the internal project matrix. The next morning, a new draft of our strategy framework was circulated for feedback. It was dated, but familiar. The language was mine, the structure identical to what I'd built a year ago. Except now it was labeled Proposed Restructure, Collaborative Model, Collaborative. A word that often appears when leadership wants to avoid admitting that something had already been done and undone. I marked the document, added 3 comments, attached the original version with timestamps. No commentary, just a short message. This may help clarify the source material. I didn't receive a reply, but 2 days later, that version became the official file. Timestamps and all. Ella didn't return. No statement, no farewell. Her office light stayed off. Her nameplate eventually disappeared. And just like that, the person who had replaced me, on paper, was gone. Not because I fought her, but because the system that protected her couldn't withstand the weight of what it refused to acknowledge. It wasn't personal, it was structural. She was placed in a role designed for performance, not pressure. And the moment pressure came, there was no depth to hold it. That's the difference between being handed a title and having grown into one. And I had never needed a title to know who I was. I just needed time for the gap between perception and reality to grow wide enough for others to fall through it on their own. The first official sign of collapse wasn't loud. It came in the form of an unexpected postponement. One of our biggest campaigns, slated for Q3 rollout, was suddenly pushed back pending structural clarity. That was the phrase Victor used in his internal update. Vague, harmless on the surface. But in this office, we all knew, when clarity is questioned, power is already slipping. Behind the scenes, meetings grew more tense. The board requested a review of all major leadership appointments in the past 12 months. Not to audit decisions, at least not officially, but to assess long-term alignment. And Ella's file, thin as it was, became an open loop no one wanted to take ownership of. Meanwhile, Victor moved differently. Less visible, less declarative. The bold energy he once used to push new initiatives now turned hesitant. He asked for more revisions, more cross-checks, more data. But no amount of data could fill the silence left by a leadership choice no one could defend. People stopped mentioning Ella's name, even the ones who had once praised her. Her absence became neutral, like an uncomfortable truth you all acknowledge without speaking. But the clients were not so quiet. Another partner escalated a concern to the board. We've experienced inconsistent messaging and leadership gaps since the internal shift. We ask that this be resolved before contract renewal. It was the 3rd note of its kind in a month. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The pattern had built itself, and I had stayed still long enough for it to become undeniable. That week, Victor requested a one-on-one. Short notice, no subject line, just, "Do you have 10 minutes?" I accepted, not with eagerness, with readiness. When I walked into the room, he was already seated. No tie. Sleeves rolled. A man holding on to composure, not control. "I want to talk about next steps," he began. I didn't interrupt. "You've been a steady hand," he said. "You kept the team grounded. And I think we both know we need that again." He didn't apologize. He didn't mention Ella. He just hovered between acknowledgement and self-preservation. I let the silence stretch before I answered. I'm not interested in returning to the role that was given away. He nodded slowly, as if he expected that. But, I added, I am willing to stabilize what matters if the structure is honest this time. No promises, no titles, just terms. Because I wasn't coming back to be convenient. I was done being invisible. Victor agreed. Of course he did. He had no other choice. And when I left that room, I wasn't vindicated. I wasn't even satisfied. I was focused. Because this wasn't about stepping back into something broken. It was about anchoring the system, just long enough to rebuild something real on the ashes of what had quietly fallen apart. The following week was quiet in the wrong way. Not the kind of quiet that comes with focus or flow, but the kind that follows disruption too large to name. Projects stalled, clients delayed, decisions sat unresolved, waiting for someone to claim ownership. And yet, no one did. I didn't rush to fill the void. I kept my pace exact, responded when asked, delivered what mattered. But I no longer extended my reach to protect what others refused to hold. That was part of the change. I had spent years softening sharp edges for the sake of team cohesion. But now, I let the edges stay sharp. Let the gaps be seen. Because if they wanted to rebuild, they needed to feel the depth of what they'd lost. On Friday morning, Victor called a team meeting. No slides, no agenda. Just a tired man in front of a quiet room, trying to salvage credibility. We've made decisions that didn't land well, he began. Moving forward, we'll be taking a more grounded approach to leadership transitions. No one asked questions, no one clapped, because everyone knew this wasn't a pivot. It was a surrender. By Monday, the board released a statement. A structural realignment is underway. Effective immediately, all director-level roles will be subject to review by the Executive Oversight Committee. It didn't name names, but it didn't have to. The silence around Ella had become a vacuum. And now that vacuum had a cost. The team that once echoed her slogans now spoke in half phrases and redirected conversations. The people who once touted her rise now dropped her name entirely. It was as if she had been cut out of the frame, only this time, not by power, but by absence. Later that week, Victor asked me to join a strategic recalibration session with 2 board members. Just for perspective, he said. But I knew what he meant. They needed something to hold on to. Something familiar, proven, silent. I arrived prepared, not with slides, but with questions. The kind that don't seek validation, but reveal structure. And by the end of the session, it was clear. They didn't just want help fixing the mess. They wanted to know how the system had worked before it broke. I didn't give them a lecture. I gave them a map, not to secure a title, but to clarify the distance between performance and real leadership. That afternoon, I walked past Ella's old office. Empty, desk cleared, nameplate gone. No send-off, just absence, now finalized. And I realized what had collapsed wasn't a person. It was a version of power built on shortcuts and proximity. And once that version cracked, there was no scaffolding underneath. I had been that scaffolding. And now, standing outside the ruins of what they tried to build without me, I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindicated. I was grounded. Because the collapse wasn't my revenge, it was their revelation. And mine had only just begun. I didn't ask for the role back. I didn't ask for recognition. I didn't even ask for the truth to be told publicly. Because by the time they realized what they had tried to replace, I had already moved on. Not to a bigger title, to a clearer one. A partner firm, one I had helped win during my time at Norview, reached out through back channels. They had seen what happened. Quietly, closely, without taking sides. But they remembered. If you're open to stepping into something more autonomous, the message read, we'd love to explore a role that gives you room to build without interference. I read the email 3 times before responding, then replied simply, let's talk. The conversation wasn't long. They didn't ask me to explain my departure. They didn't question the gap between my title and my track record. They asked what I wanted to do next and how they could get out of the way to let me do it. Within 2 weeks, the offer came. Independent strategy lead. Full control over client relations. No performance optics. No layered sign-offs. Just trust. And space. And for the first time in years, I felt what I hadn't known I was missing. Ease. Not because the work would be easy, but because it would be mine. I signed the agreement the day before Norview quietly released their revised org chart, one that listed interim oversight structures and redefining operational clarity. My name wasn't on it. Of course it wasn't. That version of me no longer existed in their frame. And I was fine with that, because I had already authored a new one. The day I moved into my new space, there were no welcome banners, just a desk, a whiteboard, a calendar with no meetings I didn't set myself. I sat down, opened a blank document, and wrote a single line: build without translation, because I was done converting vision into digestible fragments for people who hadn't done the work. I wasn't interested in proving my value anymore. I was interested in applying it, in protecting it, in refusing to let it be passed off again as someone else's instinct. And somewhere in that quiet beginning, I realized this wasn't a comeback. This was the place I had always been heading. Once I stopped asking for permission to arrive, 3 months into the new role, I received a handwritten card. No logo, no signature, just 8 words in neat slanted cursive. They tried to borrow your work. They failed. I didn't know who sent it, but I knew exactly what it meant. It didn't need a return address. The return had already happened. Not to the same seat, not to the same table, but to the center of my own trajectory, uninterrupted. I led my first advisory session with 3 new clients that quarter. All of them had once worked with Norview. None of them had asked why I left. They didn't need to. They were here because I was. Because results don't need justification when the method speaks for itself. In every meeting, I spoke less than I used to. Not out of caution, out of certainty. Because when you're no longer trying to hold your place in a room, you listen differently. You see more. You carry more impact in fewer words. One morning, a younger analyst from Norview reached out on LinkedIn. She didn't ask for a job. She just wrote, "I watched everything." Quietly, "You helped me believe I don't have to become loud to matter." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. You don't, you just have to outlast the noise. That became my measure. Not visibility, not applause, longevity. The kind that builds quietly and leaves a shape behind, even when your name is no longer on the slide. And slowly, I started to hear my name again, in the margins, in strategy rooms I hadn't stepped into, in meetings where someone quoted a model they didn't know I'd built. The system hadn't fully changed, but it had shifted. Because absence leaves a residue. And sometimes the strongest legacy is the one written in what doesn't work anymore, when you're no longer there to hold it. I never got an apology. No one from the board reached out. Victor never acknowledged the outcome. Ella never returned. But none of that mattered, because I hadn't waited for them to fix the story. I had rewritten my own. And now every framework I delivered, every result I led, every system I rebuilt, bore my name not on a plaque, but in memory. The kind that doesn't fade, because the real legacy isn't getting the role. It's knowing you defined it. And once you've done that, they can replace the name, the title, the announcement, but they can't replace the impact. That stays. Quiet, permanent, unmistakable.